one of the most profitable car brands in the entire world, lost 99% of its profits in just 9 months. Not because of a recession, not because of a war, not because of some unavoidable global catastrophe. It lost them because of decisions made in boardrooms, strategy papers, and long-term plans that nobody dared to question out loud. And here is what makes it even harder to believe. The brand we are talking about spent decades being considered bulletproof, a symbol of German engineering excellence, consistent returns, and premium power that seemed untouchable. Then, in the summer of 2025, the myth started to crack. The internal memo that leaked changed everything. Our Chief Executive Officer, Oliver Bloom, wrote 3 words that no investor ever wants to see from a company they trust. Our business model no longer works. The stock market responded immediately. Panic selling began within hours, and what followed was not just a financial story. It was the story of how one of the greatest automotive empires in history drove itself off a cliff, with its hands firmly on the wheel. This is not about China. This is not about tariffs. This is not simply about electric vehicles. This is about a company that made a series of enormous bets, refused to build an exit strategy, and is now paying a price that is measured not just in billions of euros, but in something far more fragile: trust. Let us start with the numbers, because the numbers do not lie, and in this case, they are staggering. In the first 9 months of 2025, the company generated approximately 40 million euros in operating profit. That sounds like a real number until you remember what came before it. In previous years, that figure was regularly several billion euros. What was once described as a reliable earnings machine had become, in the space of a single fiscal year, almost completely unprofitable. The operating margin, which is the true measure of how efficiently a premium manufacturer turns revenue into profit, had collapsed to just 0.2%. For a company that sells vehicles in the 6-figure price range, that number is not a warning sign. It is a complete systems failure. The third quarter of 2025 was the single most brutal 3-month period in the company's modern history. An operating loss of approximately 966 million euros in just 90 days. Now that is not a dent. That is not a correction. That is a crater. And it landed on a balance sheet that was already showing cracks. The stock market told the same story. Since the celebrated initial public offering in 2022, the share price had nearly been cut in half. What was marketed to investors as the beginning of a golden era had become, in retrospect, a cautionary tale about the gap between narrative and reality. The most painful symbol of all came when the company was removed from the Deutsche Aktienindex, the German stock market index, and replaced by a real estate listing portal. In the world of financial symbolism, it is hard to imagine a more humiliating demotion. Now, before we can understand why this happened, we need to address a comparison that gets made constantly and almost always incorrectly. The comparison between this brand and Ferrari. On the surface, both companies occupy the same cultural space: sports cars, emotion, exclusivity, premium pricing, the kind of vehicles that appear on the walls of teenage bedrooms around the world. But economically, these two companies operate in completely different universes, and confusing them is one of the most common mistakes people make when trying to understand the crisis. Ferrari earns approximately 136,000 euros per vehicle sold. This company earns approximately 18,000 euros. That gap is not just a number. It represents two fundamentally different philosophies of how to run a luxury car business. Ferrari has deliberately chosen scarcity. It produces fewer cars than it could. It turns away customers. It maintains a waiting list as a strategic asset rather than a logistical problem. For Ferrari, exclusivity is the product. The car is almost secondary. This company's model is built on the opposite foundation. It needs volume. It requires consistent, high-level sales across multiple market segments to justify the enormous fixed costs that come with running a full-scale automotive manufacturer. Without those volumes, the math stops working almost immediately. And that is precisely what has happened. The volumes have collapsed, and with them, the margins. The result is a company trapped in an extremely uncomfortable middle ground. Too expensive for genuine mass-market competition. Not exclusive enough to command Ferrari-level margins. Neither Tesla's technology story nor Ferrari's scarcity premium. A sports car manufacturer with industrial complexity are trying to survive in a world that has decided it wants either something emotionally irreplaceable or something technologically revolutionary. Being neither of those things is the most dangerous place a car company can be. The management team's official explanation for what happened focused heavily on external pressures. United States tariffs, they said, would cost the company approximately 700 million euros. That is a real number and a genuine burden, but it is also a convenient explanation. Tariffs alone do not cause a 99% profit collapse. They do not explain structural failures that have been building for years. They do not account for the strategic decisions that made the company vulnerable in the first place. China is the other favorite explanation, and it contains more truth, but still misses the essential point. For decades, the Chinese market was one of the most reliable profit engines in the global automotive industry. In that country, success and status were expressed through specific vehicles, and this brand's sport utility vehicles and luxury sedans were among the most coveted symbols of arrival. At the peak, the company was selling approximately 95,000 vehicles per year in China. In 2025, that number had fallen to roughly 40,000. More than half the market gone. But here is the critical distinction that gets lost in every conversation about China. China is not the cause of this crisis. China is the amplifier. The Chinese market did not create the problems. It simply exposed them with devastating efficiency. The decisions that are destroying this company today were not made in Beijing. They were made in Stuttgart. They were made in strategy documents, in product planning meetings, and in boardrooms where the wrong questions were being asked with supreme confidence. China and tariffs are, above all else, convenient scapegoats. The uncomfortable truth is that this company has been strategically lost for years. The external headwinds are hitting a business that was already off balance, and that imbalance has a very specific origin story. It began in 2022, during one of the most celebrated moments in the company's recent history. The initial public offering valued the company at approximately 78 billion euros. Financial media celebrated it as the launch of a new chapter. Analysts used phrases like version 2.0 and golden age. The company presented itself as modern, forward-thinking, and technologically dominant. And at the center of all of that was a clear, bold, heavily marketed electric vehicle strategy. By 2030, the plan stated approximately 80% of all newly delivered vehicles would be fully electric. This was framed not as a concession to regulatory pressure or environmental obligation. It was framed as the next era of dominance. The strategy was communicated consistently and forcefully, internally and externally. Alternatives were barely discussed. The course was set. Then reality arrived. Customers discovered that electric sports cars are not just technically demanding, they are extraordinarily expensive to own and terrifying to depreciate. When someone spends 200,000 euros on a vehicle and watches its resale value drop by half within a few years, they do not simply accept that as the cost of progress. They walk away. Oh, and they did. The market cooled far faster than anyone in the company's planning department had projected. The real problem was not the market cooling. The real problem was that by the time the market showed its true temperature, the company was already fully committed. Billions had been deployed. The strategy was locked. There was no meaningful exit plan for a scenario where the world did not adopt electric vehicles at the speed the spreadsheets had assumed. The flagship electric vehicle, which had been announced as a direct competitor to Tesla and marketed as proof that a traditional sports car manufacturer could not just match but redefine the electric performance category, became the most painful symbol of the company's struggles. Technically, it had been considered a masterpiece. Strong performance numbers, impressive charging speeds, uncompromising driving dynamics. For a period, the plan seemed to be working. Then the deliveries fell by approximately 49% in 2024. In a single year, the vehicle that was supposed to lead the brand into its electric future had become a problem case. The price was part of it. Many customers were willing to spend significant money on an electric vehicle from this brand, but not unconditionally and not without trust. And trust, it turned out, was exactly what the vehicle was struggling to build. Customer reports began accumulating: frozen touchscreens, interrupted charging sessions, unexplained electronic failures. Service centers became overwhelmed. Customer frustration became visible and vocal. And then came the recall. More than 27,000 vehicles called back because of potential fire risk. In the automotive industry, recalls are not unusual. But at this price point in this brand segment, a recall does not function as a logistical inconvenience. It functions as a statement of doubt. When someone has paid 150,000 euros for a vehicle, they should not feel like a beta tester. The moment that feeling takes hold, the central promise of the brand, precision, quality, reliability, has been broken. And once that promise breaks, it does not repair itself easily. Rumors about battery problems spread throughout automotive communities, regardless of whether every individual claim was verified. In the premium segment, the distinction between verified fact and persistent rumor barely matters. Trust operates on perception, and perception had shifted. The company then placed enormous internal hope in a project known internally as Project K1. This was to be the brand's new flagship, a large vehicle with 3 rows of seating, internally nicknamed the bus for millionaires. Originally conceived as a pure electric flagship, a symbol of the company's commitment to its electric future, the project became the site of the most expensive single strategic reversal in the company's history. The decision was made, quietly and then irreversibly to redesign the vehicle to accommodate combustion engines and hybrid powertrains in addition to the electric version. When the news leaked internally, the financial implications became clear almost immediately. The cost of the transition and the flexibilization of the model range alone generated approximately 1.3 billion euros in extraordinary charges. So combined with the total investment required for 2025, approximately 3.1 billion euros to adapt production and development to the revised plans, the project became what several industry experts have described as one of the single most expensive mistakes in modern automotive history. The reason the costs were so catastrophic was structural. Stopping the original electric platform meant discarding work that had already been completed, scrapping battery concepts that had already been designed, tested, and partially manufactured. Everything had to be developed twice. Everything had to be paid for twice. The company had committed fully to one direction, reversed course mid-execution, and was now bearing the full financial weight of both journeys simultaneously. Beyond the financial damage was something harder to quantify, but equally destructive: the cultural damage. This brand had spent decades building an identity around a very specific set of values: emotion, sound, the physical sensation of driving a machine that feels alive, the kind of car that does not just transport you from one place to another, but transforms the experience of being in transit into something worth remembering. The brand had decided it wanted to be more than a car manufacturer. It wanted to be a technology company. Massive investments were made in software projects. The results were, to put it generously, underwhelming. Software divisions failed to deliver. The electric version of one of the company's most beloved smaller models was delayed by years because the systems simply did not function. And while all of this was happening, the combustion engine version of the same model had to be discontinued entirely. New European Union cybersecurity regulations made the cost of keeping it compliant prohibitively expensive. The timing was almost tragically perfect. At the exact moment when customers were asking loudly for traditional combustion-powered vehicles, the company was legally unable to provide them. This exposes the fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of the entire strategic failure. The people who buy these vehicles do not buy them to make an environmental statement. They buy them for an experience. For the sound of a high-performance engine, for the feel of the road through the steering wheel, for the emotional charge of sitting behind the wheel of something that has a genuine character. The electric flagship may be fast, it may be technically sophisticated, but its silence, the absence of that defining acoustic identity, communicates not progress, but loss. And customers felt that loss. The entry-level models that traditionally serve as the first step into the brand's world, the Roadster and the Coupe that have introduced generations of enthusiasts to what the company stands for, had originally been planned to go fully electric. Then, under the weight of all the strategic reversals, combustion engines came back onto the table. Sales of these entry-level models dropped by approximately 15%. That number carries more weight than it might appear. Every missing entry-level customer is a missing future customer for the larger, more expensive vehicles. See, every absent first-generation enthusiast is an absent brand loyalist a decade from now. The company is not just losing sales. It is losing the pipeline that has historically generated the next generation of buyers. And underneath all of this financial and cultural damage sits one more layer of pressure that rarely gets discussed publicly: the financial structure of the founding family. A central figure within the family's ownership network took on a loan of approximately 1.1 billion euros in 2017 to consolidate influence and control over company shares. Private debt of that scale requires servicing. Servicing that debt requires stable dividends. In 2025, dividends from the holding company had already fallen by 25%. The family's net worth had contracted by approximately $3 billion since the initial public offering. The pressure to protect short-term income flows had become a structural constraint on the company's ability to invest in its own future. Necessary reforms were being delayed. New platforms were being deprioritized. Every available euro of capital was being directed toward maintaining dividend payments rather than building the competitive capabilities that the company desperately needed. The result is a company driving with its emergency brake engaged. Not because its leadership does not understand what needs to be done, but because the financial architecture surrounding the company makes bold, patient, long-term investment almost structurally impossible. The leadership transition that followed was significant. The long-serving chief executive officer stepped down. His replacement came from Ferrari and McLaren, a man with deep engineering credentials and a clear understanding of what authentic premium positioning actually requires. He inherited not just a financial crisis, but a strategic one. Failed electric plans, abandoned projects, demoralized employees. A brand identity that had been stretched in too many directions simultaneously and had lost its coherence in the process. By 2029, the company plans to eliminate approximately 3,900 positions. The new leadership must stabilize the finances, clarify the product strategy, and reconnect the brand to the emotional identity that made it valuable in the first place. He must do all of this simultaneously, under enormous internal and external pressure, with a family ownership structure that constrains his room for maneuver. The question that defines the next decade is not whether this brand can survive. Of course, it can survive. The question is whether it can recover the thing that made it genuinely special, and whether the people now in charge have both the clarity to see what that thing was and the courage to rebuild it before the window closes, because windows do close. And in the premium automotive market, where brand identity is the primary product, they can close faster than any quarterly earnings report will tell you. This story is not just about one company. It is about what happens when a brand forgets what it stands for, when strategy replaces soul, when the pressure to chase trends overwhelms the discipline to defend what made something great in the first place. The most valuable thing any company owns is not its factories, its patents, or its balance sheet. It is the trust of the people who believe in what it represents. Once that trust is damaged, no amount of restructuring can buy it back quickly. It has to be earned. One vehicle at a time. One honest decision at a time. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what is really happening inside the automotive industry, the real decisions, the real failures, and the real stakes, then hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Every week we go deeper into the stories behind the brands, the numbers behind the headlines, and the decisions that shape the future of the cars you love. Turn on notifications so you never miss an analysis, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the new leadership can turn this around, or is the damage already too deep?